Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to my presentation on the vampire panic of the 18th and 19th century and how it correlates with disease and medicine. Some of you might be here for the HS220 class, and since I'm posting this on YouTube, anybody can see it. So we're just going to learn about some vampires. Stakes will be plunged, heads will roll, and let's just dive right into it. So a brief historical overview. So through this presentation, we'll be exploring the vampire panic, if you will, and how it kind of played an aspect in the 17th century or the 1700s. And throughout this presentation, however, I will challenge you guys to think about how this correlates or mirrors the various explanations of plagues and sicknesses, whether it be the king's disease, whether it be the Justinian plague. All of these kind of correlate in the explanations of how they occurred, as well as like various cures or remedies that followed these typically. To provide some background or overview, New England was ravaged and, dare I say, devastated by a horrible tuberculosis outbreak in the 17th to 19th centuries. The disease was actually the main cause of mortality for almost 200 years, with 25% of all deaths. And despite an abundance of remedies given by a dispersed range of practitioners, a consumption diagnosis was attributed to the early vampires. So from now on, consumption is essentially the fancy word for, oh, this person's being fed upon by a vampire. I guess it's just written that way, so it doesn't sound that crazy, but it kind of is. So based on Bell, one of my article authors, this originated from the Polish or Slavic descent, but it's kind of hard to tell because this all started to occur around the mid-1700s. So this is significant to look back on, as the supposed vampire can reflect the ideologies of the time. We have to think about this is a society that uses basic observation and then boosts it to straight up scientific explanation. So through this way, we can understand how scientists and people went about this and how this can be taken as a learning experience for body preservation and the effects of common sickness, such as tuberculosis. So we kind of already went over this, but just to reiterate, the definition of a vampire, the word vampire, of course, is spelled different. I believe it's V-A-M-P-I-R, originated from Slavic and Polish descent, but it's hard to tell because this once again occurred all at the same time. But essentially, the term vampire, it didn't essentially evolve into what it is today. It began as kind of like an understanding of an undead or like an undead witch of some sort. It's kind of hard to tell. It varies depending on the text that you're talking about when it comes to the 17th century, around the 1600s. Though we have to understand that similar ideas of the vampire were present through the time. A lot of various cultures had the notion of this creature that takes upon or takes control of a deceased person's body and feeds upon the living. This was a very common idea at the time. So once again, I'll move myself out of the way here. We have to understand, of course, it's kind of hard to tell, but we need to understand that we need to separate pop culture from reality. So of course, we have the typical Twilight Zone. I mean, not Twilight, it's just the Twilight movies, which kind of popularized the romantic vampire, the present day vampire. But we have to understand that these are different times. The idea of the vampire and its abilities evolved over hundreds of years. So we have to understand that we don't have any vampires turning into bats. We don't have the notion of vampire bites cause you to become a vampire. And the vampires of old were essentially just bloodthirsty undead beings that may or may not just be your uncle. But typically it was a family member that fed upon you or got you sick, because they would die and then you would die as well, which was very strange for the time, you know. But of course, in the case of tuberculosis or TB, it was not uncommon. So yeah, just had to get that out of the way. Of course, we're not talking about some teen drama vampire movie or anything like that. So we have this awesome guy that is just he's just a badass. So essentially, Dom Augustine Calmet, who was born in 1672 to 1757, was kind of living out this period of the evolution of the vampire and kind of how that started to come more and more into the culture of the time, and everyone started to talk about it. So he's essentially this French monk theologian who wrote two really great books on essentially anything undead, anything supernatural, which include the Treaty of Vampire and Revenants and The Phantom World, both published in 1751, just 6 years before his death. So it's kind of hard because both versions had really bad English translations. So I'm going to try my best to explain them because they were both written in 18th century French. But essentially, both books touch on three main things here. We have ghosts, apparitions, and vampires. So essentially, Calmet is traveling in specifically Hungary. He talks a lot about his travels in Hungary during both these books. He's going to Hungary. He's going to villages that have these very strange stories of seeing demons, seeing things take over people, and people getting sick and dying. He's reading all these stories and seeing their explanations of why this is occurring. And he's writing about it, and he's questioning how this is occurring. What are some scientific explanations for this? But he's kind of like teeter-tottering over whether this is true or not. But he's taking some really good questions into detail. Really good questions that I read about that are awesome is, does a demon have the power to resurrect a dead body? He really takes into question this. Like, what are the powers of demons? Because if people are getting possessed and eating or sucking the life out of people, how is this occurring? Or does a demon have the power to do that? We also have the questions of, can a vampire put a person into a trance or make them see visions? And also, why is the dirt not disturbed when a vampire comes up in the night and then returns to the grave? These were all really good questions they began to ask and really try to explain. So with that all in account, I'll be mentioning Calmet later, but we need to focus on the symptoms of vampirism. So there's two main sides to this. We have the people being the vampires themselves, the undead, and then we also have the people being affected by the vampires. So in terms of the vampires themselves, they were usually deceased individuals that were suspected of being undead and feeding upon the living, and thus slowly draining the life force of a person, specifically in the deceased person's household. This is usually suspected when a body is being moved or accidentally opened after burial, only to find a perfectly preserved body or a bloated body with blood coming out of the mouth. We see multiple accounts that I'll be explaining with where there's a brown coated body, but it's perfectly flexible even 15 years after its death. Just weird stuff that people didn't really understand when it came to preservation of the body. And then also the bloated body, which I'll touch on later. This idea soon became the basis that a vampire will rise from the grave at night, feed on the living, and then would return to the grave before morning. Now, the effects on the living consisted of the person being fed or haunted upon by a vampire. If one was seeing visions of a dead family member, or feeling like their life is slowly being drained from them, they're getting gray, them not being able to move so much. These were essentially taken as symptoms of, oh yeah, you're getting fed upon by your dead family member or a vampire. This was later to be known as consumption, which I stated earlier, which is just essentially that, oh yeah, a vampire is feeding upon you and your family members. So the public's reaction for the 1700s to 1800s is very obvious. It's very, very obvious because we see these just crazy reactions to disease. And this is not an exception. we see people digging up graves, mass panic, and occurrences pretty much happening all over Europe, even in America, which I'll touch on in this slide. So to reflect on this kind of explanation of how people reacted, one of the people I researched, Gerald Van Swieten, through his 1755 work Vampirismus, says it best: if people are faced with things whose cause they cannot understand, they tend to seek that cause in a higher power than of mere humans. In other words, if people do not understand something, they look for a supernatural explanation. And this can be seen throughout centuries. This various idea can be seen throughout all of the plagues that we focused on prior to the 1800s. And this supernatural cause, once again, was hard to pinpoint where it originated. But early accounts based on Calmet suggest that Germany and Swedish islands, as well as Polish areas, can be possible for the vampire. It would be later resourced to Transylvania through the works of Dracula, but that's something for a later slide there. So essentially, another great primary source that kind of explains this idea of preservation of bodies and explanation of the vampire comes from Keithworth, in where he's identifying this article of William of Newburgh. And it essentially states that whilst they were taking what they had to dig up a body at a greater depth, they suddenly, before much of the earth had been removed, laid bare a corpse, swollen in enormous corpulence, with a countenance beyond measure, turgid and suffused with blood, so bloated with blood, while the napkin in which it had been wrapped appeared nearly torn to pieces. The young men, however, spurred by the wrath, feared not, and inflicted a wound upon the senseless carcass, out of which incontinently flowed such a stream of blood that it might have been taken from a leech, filled with blood of many persons. Then, dragging it beyond the village, they speedily constructed a funeral pile, and upon one of them, saying that the pestral body would be not burned unless its heart were torn out, the other opened its side, and by repeated blows with a blunt spade, and thrust in his hand, he dragged out the accursed heart. So this guy, these people noticed that, oh yeah, this body's kind of bloated and it has a bunch of blood on it. They essentially they take out the body and drag it to a funeral pile outside the village, and then a guy essentially says, "Oh yeah, we need to rip out its heart because it's still gonna like feed off the living. It's still gonna drink the blood that it has all over itself." So then another guy essentially beats it with a blunt spade in its chest and takes his hand and rips out the guy's heart. That's pretty crazy. But the funny thing is that this kind of notion of, oh, we need to do something to ensure that this body won't be revived later on. This idea continues until the 20th century, all the way into the late 1800s. For example, in Rhode Island, this spreads to America later on. There's a story of Mercy Brown of Exeter in Rhode Island, who died of tuberculosis in 1892. And her brother, Edwin, subsequently fell ill. Weird, right? Her body was essentially burned, and her heart was burned as well, but saved. The ashes were then consumed by Edwin, but as we would guess, of course, it failed to save him. And it's essentially is just an interesting story there because it demonstrates that some residents of Eastern United States continued to respond to tuberculosis deaths with anti-vampire exemptions way into the late 1890s. So yeah, just a couple of stories there to give you guys an idea there. So let's take a moment to kind of reflect on this kind of artwork here. It's called Death of a Vampire, and it's by Renee here, who created it in 1816. So right kind of around the period where it's peaking, this whole vampire craze. So this image kind of reflects the public's ideologies of how the vampire panic occurred and what to do. So I'm going to just take a second to ask you guys, what do you see? What are some things that you see in this picture? It might be a little blurry, sorry. All right. Well, the focused image, of course, that we see in the center is of a man essentially stabbing a skeleton. It's not even a corpse anymore. It's a skeleton with a hot stake or iron rod, kind of reflecting on the beliefs that, yeah, if you stab the dead person's heart, it won't revive, right? It's funny to me that the people in the image in the background and in the foreground too look like they have no idea what they're doing. The guy's going like, whoa, whoa, just something to look on. And you even can see some of the townsfolk, and it kind of looks like Noble standing in that tree right there, just like kind of observing it from a distance. You have to be safe from those deadly miasmas of the dead body. So ways to combat vampires. Of course, we have the classic stake. We have the classic iron rod. Sometimes a crucifix, but it's hard. I don't think that that's necessarily apparent for the time being. But based on the text of Calmet and Bell, the overall goal to prevent further vampire deaths to occur was to destroy the bodies completely. Ways in which to do this varied, but all of the above consisted of burning, decapitation, and the classic stake through the heart. Though some individuals began being killed for being suspected of being a vampire, but a living vampire. So even some people with receded gums or the kind of grayish form, they began being executed as being thought of a vampire. Based on a scholarly article of National Art Network, some archaeologists in Poland actually dug up a body located in the bottom right there of a woman of a noble background. She's being buried with her arms and legs shackled to the ground and a scythe running across her neck. So as if she were to come up, hopefully her head would fall off. So some interesting things to think about of how people reacted to this, and even nobility couldn't escape being associated with maybe being a vampire. This next slide just kind of shows a couple more images just to make sure. It's the two skeleton images I will be talking about real quick. So here's just some further evidence of just maybe these were vampire sightings or vampire burials. In Ireland specifically, we have a very large portion of skeletons being buried with rocks in their mouths. Of course, this might not be attributed to vampires, but it's an interesting thing because it kind of reflects, oh, we don't want this person to maybe speak, maybe bite down, or anything like that. Once they revive, or we don't want them to revive. We also see a couple instances, especially in Poland, 2 or 3, of skeletons having their gums or teeth filed down. And of course, once again, this might not be attributed to vampirism, but it just explains the idea of, oh, we need to prepare the body in some way to ensure that it's either safe or keep others safe. So let's look at the reality here. Of course, yes, sorry to spoil it, vampires aren't real, but we can attribute it to various sicknesses of the time. So further into the 18th century, we begin to see actual scientific explanations and observations being made concerning the quoted vampire panic. In New England, it was believed that consumption was not a physical but a spiritual disease. As long as the body of a dead consumptive relative has blood in his heart, it is proof of an occult influence. So they needed to drain the blood, get rid of the heart, all of that. And that's based on the New England anthropologist George Stesson in 1896. In Bell's work, Vampires and Death in in his work, Vampires and Death in New England, it is stated that by 1800, TB was killing around 250 individuals in the United States and over 25% in Europe, according to like the daily mortality rate. And we also can attribute this to, okay, so to go back a little bit, so the common sickness or the common attributed sickness to TB was TB actually. And a really interesting reason is that, yes, it slowly drained the body. It slowly turned the person gray or yellow, as we talked in class. This also, interestingly, caused some forms of psychosis. So that's kind of explains why people started to see weird visions of, oh, I see this weird black figure in my room. I see my grandma that died last week in my room. So yeah, very interesting stuff. Another interesting explanation is porphyria, which is a hereditary blood illness in which the body produces less heme, a necessary component in hemoglobin, which is a protein in red blood cells. And some of the symptoms of this included the sensitivity to sunlight, fangs, which it was the receding of the gums, of course, blood drinking, which actually wasn't blood drinking. People just thought it was blood drinking because the person urinated a dark red crimson, which usually was peeing blood. So that's something interesting to think about. Now, how do we explain the preservation of the bodies? Well, Gerald Van Swieten visited various graves in cities in which bodies have been examined and claimed to be vampires. He takes notes on, once again, how a 15-year-old body is still preserved. And then he concludes that I therefore conclude that if a coffin is well closed, and if the soil is hard and dense and is made of more firm through cold air after the funeral, or if any reasons block air from the entering coffin, then there will either be no rot or a very slow one. So we get to see people actually making explanations for body preservation, which is an awesome, really good jump in the scientific realm of that. A further explanation of this is based on Keyworth, is that bacteria in the body produces gas, causing the abdomen to swell and look bloated, sometimes forcing blood from the lungs to trickle out the mouth. And within 3 days after death, muscle fibers decay and rigor mortis retreats, allowing the limbs to become more flexible. So that's why there was flexibility in the limbs days after death. So the vampire impact henceforth, of course, Dracula, which was a popular one, made in 1897. But we also get to see that Dracula doesn't necessarily turn into just a disease. It becomes a folktale and even romanticized later. And this is thanks to pop culture or culture of the time. And capturing the imaginations of the audience worldwide. And the vampire's appeal was further reinforced by Bram Stoker's iconic novel, Dracula, which portrayed vampires as aristocratic and sophisticated beings. So yeah, that's how people began to be like, oh, vampires are scary, but kind of cool, I guess you could say. Over the years, the vampire's image continued to evolve, with various media showcasing different takes of the legendary creature, from traditional vampire tropes to modern day interpretations. Vampires have remained the staple form of kind of the horror culture that we know today. But yeah, that's just something to think about there. So reflecting on these ideologies, I'll move myself out of the way here once more. So this kind of once again mirrors the idea of a pattern of superstition, a pattern of scapegoating, similar to that of blaming other races or blaming it on witches, miasmas, etc., all of which were essentially just a use of scapegoating. Though, of course, the idea of using superstition and blaming it to determine the cause and spread of disease would fall away up until the 19th century, based on Bueller's journal digging up the truth about vampires. Today, we no longer hear about anti-vampire measures, yet vampires still interest us. For example, this discovery of the 7-year-old anti-vampire tomb in the Bulgarian town of Zozopol in 2012 was covered by National Geographic. And we still see people being drawn to this kind of idea of, oh, we really like to know a little more about what people thought about vampires, because it just intrigues us. as Bueller states, public health precautions, advanced diagnostic procedures, and antibiotics have replaced the armory of crosses, garlic necklaces, wooden stakes, and other vampire paraphernalia. Vampires are still depicted in popular culture, of course, but we no longer think of them as dead corpses rising to spread among the living. So in conclusion, we just have to thank the people for scientific analysis, specifically thanks to the works of Sweeten and Calment. They went out, they asked very good questions about how is this body being preserved? Why is this spreading? Why are people thinking that it's a vampire or a dead relative? Because based on their works, we can really look back and determine, oh, this explains what they thought based on no past scientific knowledge. So yeah, it's a really good story. It was really fun to research this. And yeah, I might just go on a little vampire binge watch. Maybe watch some Nosferatu or something like that. But yeah, thank you guys so much for listening to this presentation. And here's my bibliography. I'm on myself, by the way.